Namaskar. I'm going to have a series today, a series called Changing India. This is a 1 hour series, 1 hour, a few minute series on three very relevant subjects. And I'm going to start with my first subject. The first is economy. The changing economy of changing India from 1947 to 2021. How did India change? How did Indian economy change? I've got two very distinguished guests to speak about it. Akhilesh Bhargav, of course, you all know, our business editor, and Dr. Arun Kumar, one of the foremost economists of India. Let's get right into the show. Thank you so much for joining me on this show and wish you a very, very happy Independence Day. The first question I want to ask you, and that to you, Dr. Saab, is what was the vision, what was the strategy that our founding fathers had when they were planning our economy?
I'm reminded of my father. He was the first person from his village who had crossed 8th class, education. And then he went on to become a professor in Allahabad University in 1946. And I used to ask him, what is it that reason why you joined the national movement, the freedom movement? And he used to say, coming from a very poor background, because of education, I could rise up to be a professor in Allahabad University, the premier university in North India. So he said, our vision was that we should give education to everybody, we should give health to everybody, we should eliminate poverty, we should do everything that the common person needs, because the British were not doing it. The colonial rule was not doing it. Education was negligible. In the 1911 census, only 11% Indians were educated. And even by 1951, it was only 16% Indians who were educated. So there was lack of science and technology, there was lack of education, lack of health, etc. So the vision of national movement was that the individual is not to blame for the problems that he faces. If he doesn't have education, he cannot set up a school or a college. If he doesn't have health, he cannot set up a dispensary. So the state was given a large role in eliminating the problems that the individual had. So the individual is not to blame. The collective had to take the responsibility for education, for health, for poverty removal, for employment generation. And that's why the state was given the roles. The state was a reflection of the collectivity. So therefore, in 1947, when we gained independence, the idea was that we will collectively solve all our problems. So that was the founding principle on which our state policies were based in 1947. And you saw that all kinds of things came, like the industrial policy resolution came as to what kind of industry we'll set up. And that was based on the 1944 Frank Thakurdas committee, what was called the Bombay Plan. The Bombay Plan said that, we don't have the capital and we need a large public sector to help the private sector to grow. And that is what came in the post-independence period after 1947, and again in the industrial policy resolution of 1958, etc. So in other words, there was a whole idea that, we have to reduce poverty. For that, we have to reduce luxury consumption. So therefore, from the national movement, which was based on simplicity, Gandhi's simplicity, of a very simple lifestyle, so we can save for development. And that's why as soon as independence came, the rate of growth of the Indian economy suddenly shot up. Between 1900 and 1950, the data says that the average rate of growth of the Indian economy was around 0.5, 0.7%. And suddenly after 1950, the rate of growth shot up to 4.5%. So there's a huge break, because what were the resources that were wasted during the British rule suddenly started getting deployed for independent India, for overcoming the various problems. And then, you see in 1950s, during the period, that decade, the entire structure of the Indian economy and society was set up, whether it be the planning commission, whether it be the elections, whether it be the space, whether it be scientific development, setting up of universities and colleges, of health centers and so on. So suddenly what you found was that the situation started changing after independence. And that was because of the vision of the national movement that we have to collectively solve the problems of our country.
I have a couple of questions for Dr. Arun Kumar, if you permit me.
Please, Akhilesh.
Dr. Kumar, I have a first question which is leapfrogging to today from what you said, which is, the founding fathers had got simplicity in mind and having, if I were to use a bit of a more extreme word, frugality in mind, not having consumption. But today's economics is all very consumption driven. So did India lose out in those decades on account of its emphasis on simplicity and low spending versus spending and consumption to drive the economy today?
So, an economy, a modern day economy depends on expenditures. Expenditures can come out of consumption, they can also come out of investment. So, what happened was that, investment started rising, and today what you see is a lot of investment. So, the rate of investment in the economy is about, it had, before the pandemic reached about 30% or so. In 2012-13, it was 37%, So obviously investment plus consumption, they add up to what the GDP is. So if the investment is higher, consumption is lower. So in the 1950s, the investment and savings rate were only about 5 to 7%. So bulk of it was in that sense consumption. So the economy in the 1950s was most consumption oriented because it was a pretty backward economy. It had very low capacity, large amount of people were very poor, they could only consume. There was very little of investment and savings. So in a sense, that time it was more consumption oriented. But what you're referring to is consumerism. When we talk about simplicity and frugality, the idea is to save as much as possible for investment because it is investment that drives growth. Consumption only follows after growth takes place, incomes rise, then consumption takes place. But post 1991, we have gone in for consumerism. And that consumerism actually began in the 1980s itself when the IMF program came because we had a balance of payment problem in 1979-80. And then the IMF told us to liberalize our imports. So we allowed Maruti to come in, color television, scooters, refrigerators, and all kinds of consumer goods started coming in. Okay. So that consumerism, what it meant was that the resources that could have been used for further increasing investment, those became less. So in other words, if you reduce consumerism, you'll have more resources for investment, and that will then help create employment more than what consumerism will do. It will also lead to maybe more employment generation as investment rises. So in other words, consumerism is not necessarily the best way to develop an economy. It's through investment that, increasing investment, especially in a poor economy like India, where disparities are massive, where unemployment is very large at the moment, those become a problem. Also, you see, the pandemic has shown us that we are a collectivity. Once again, it's reinforcing what we learned in 1947, that we are a collectivity and we have to solve our problems collectively. So the pandemic has shown that health problems, employment issues, etc., are all problems of collectivity. This virus also we have to tackle collectively. If we don't tackle it collectively, if it persists, it'll keep mutating and keep spreading. So in other words, the 1947 vision, the national movement vision of collectivity is being reinforced by the pandemic now.
Doctor, thanks for that. I have another question to you, Doctor. And that is, the Bombay plan had laid an emphasis on rapid industrialization, if I recall correctly. And they said that probably the state would have to do that. Do you think that the roots of license Raj lie in that? And it took us so many years, right up to 1991, before it was abolished. Do you think that became a curse on the growth of the economy because we lost out to our peers in the process?
So as I said, you see, our rate of growth jumped in 1950s, from about 0.5% on an average between 1901 and 1950, it grew to 4.5%. But the problem that came up was that we, instead of following Gandhi's idea of development from below, we went in from development from above. We thought we would quickly copy Western modernity and become like a Western society, like a European or American society. So we invested heavily on large projects, large dams, large factories, etc. And we hope that through trickle down, the poor people would also benefit. Now, in a modern economy, the trickle down is very little. And therefore, what happened was there was development at the top. Okay. Now, to do rapid development, what you required was to copy the Soviet model of central planning. And central planning requires licensing and, the allocation of resources in a proper way. Now, that helps you to develop quicker because you are using your resources better. If you leave it without planning, then, some areas would have massive investment, other areas would not have investment. So there'd be a problem of mismatch. For instance, when the sugar industry was opened up in the 1930s, suddenly there's massive over-investment in sugar industry. So other areas where investment should have gone, those areas suffered. So we have many examples. When you leave it entirely to the market forces, then you can have more investment somewhere and less investment in other areas that are critical. For instance, post independence, we have not spent adequately on education and health. We should have spent 6% of GDP on education. We should have spent at least 3% on health. But we've never crossed 4% on education. We've never crossed 1.3% on health. So because of that, our social indicators are very poor. And we see that in the pandemic, that poor people's health, poor people's education, that has suffered enormously. And as the annual survey of education reports point out, 50% children in rural areas in the 5th class cannot read second class textbook, cannot do second class maths, and so on. Now these children will drop out of school, they will remain poor. So you are assured of 50% poverty for the next 50 years till these children go out of the job market, and that too, provided we immediately start, spending more on education and health. So in other words, resource allocation is very important for rapid development of an economy. Now, therefore, licensing came. But what happened was that the businessmen in India were not, very favorable to that, and therefore they started doing crony capitalism. Through crony capitalism, that licensing was undone because licenses were cornered, etc. And that's why monopoly houses started growing rapidly in the 50s and the 60s itself. And there was a discussion in the parliament between Ram Manohar Lohia and Nehru on the poverty. And Ram Manohar Lohia castigated Nehru, saying that in spite of all your socialist policies and state intervention, poverty is persisting and poverty is increasing, whereas monopoly houses are growing. So the Hazari Committee was set up, and the Hazari Commission report came, and they showed that businessmen were following, the big businessmen were following an umbrella pattern of holding. So they were cornering licenses. They were, across companies. You couldn't tell who was owning which kind of capital, and therefore licensing was totally misused. Licensing was cornered. But that is not necessarily, a function of licensing. That is because of crony capitalism. That's because of corruption. That's because of black income generation. If our state policies had been better implemented, then this may not have happened. So therefore, our problem was that not only were licenses, etc., cornered, but development was not filtering down to the bottom. And that's why you had the Naxal movement in 1967, because the poor were getting fed up. And you had the angry young man in the 1970s, when the young people finding unemployment and poverty persisting, they started revolting. And in the Indian cinema, you had the angry young man coming. And then you had the emergency. So in other words, there was crisis after crisis because we followed the bottom-up approach. And 1991 onward, also the bottom-up approach has become even more strengthened. And that's why the inequalities have started rising even more dramatically after 1991. So it's not really to do with licensing, etc. It's to do with lack of consensus on policies. The big business did not have consensus on policies, and that's why they just kept playing with it, and they kept trying to corner licenses and do various other things. So I think we have to have a proper understanding of the political economy. Why is it that what was agreed to by businessmen, that broke down in the 50s and 60s, licenses were cornered, monopolies started getting created, and in spite of the MRTP Act coming, monopolies kept growing, because they knew how to corner licenses and so on and so forth, and that created other economic problems, because when you have growing disparities, then major macroeconomic problems start appearing, and therefore, there was also social and political discontent, as a result of that, and that's why you had, fragmentation of politics. 1967 onward, our politics started getting fragmented because people, large number of people realized that they were not getting the fruits of development. So Congress started splintering because different groups started coming out of Congress. And therefore, the Congress, which was dominant in the 50s and the 60s, and now you have, 1,600 political parties registered with the Election Commission, because every, caste and subcaste wants its own leader, because everybody realizes that you need to manipulate policies to be able to get gains for your own group. So you have Kurmis and Keuris and this and that, all kinds of, parties represented by some leader from that community, they have emerged. And that's the loss of faith in policies, loss of faith in the leadership. If the leadership is not delivering to everybody, So this trickle-down policy that we followed post-47, that is what has led to crisis after crisis in the Indian economy.
Are you saying that license Raj was actually good?
No, so you see, there are two components of it. You see, for optimal utilization of resources, you needed licensing. But for that to work properly, you needed a consensus among the elite in the country, the industrialists in the business community, the political class, etc. Okay, that consensus broke down. That consensus that was there, say, in the Bombay Plan of 1944, that consensus that was there in the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1958, that consensus was breaking down. And because of the breakdown of consensus, our big business saw opportunity that they could do crony capitalism. So the problem, the breakdown of licensing, etc., was due to crony capitalism. People are cornering licenses, etc. So it's not inevitable that that should happen. It is a question of your political economy within which your policy makers, your big business, etc., they start manipulating policy. So it's not that policy can always be manipulated and policy will fail. Policy can work provided the different groups that have proposed those policies, they have a consensus and they implement it the way it is supposed to be implemented, right? So in the 60s and the 70s, that consensus broke, and that's why I said, the fruits of development didn't trickle down, and that's why post 65, when you had the big drought in East India, where we were living from ship to mouth, because we had a lack of food grains, and the PL 480 was coming, and that was used by the World Bank and the US to pressurize India into changing its policy track. So therefore, there was a lot of confusion because we didn't do development from below. Policies were getting manipulated by businessmen, by forces from outside, and all that was creating more and more problem. So we had the 3 planned holidays in 67, 68, 69. Okay, then we had the a big breakdown when the Yom Kippur War came in 1973. There's a big inflation, etc., that took place at that time, and that led to the JP movement, against corruption, and the youth movement, and that led to the emergency. So we have crisis after crisis because the development did not take place from below. And then you had 1979-80 when the Janata government falls, and simultaneously Afghanistan, the crisis takes place, the Iran crisis takes place, and the oil prices rise again. And that leads to further crisis in our balance of payment in 1980. We go to the IMF, and the IMF and the World Bank panic us into doing more and more of imports so that we can have consumer goods and consumerism in the country. And that led to the 1989 crisis when there was again balance of payment crisis because the oil prices were rising dramatically in 1989-90. So you can see that how from one crisis to the next crisis, every decade, 60s, 70s and 80s, we kept on having problems. So it was not just licensing, it was A, the crony capitalism, and B, the lack of development from below, and the trickle-down theories on which we based our economic policies. These two, I think, are the problem which led to the breakdown of the consensus amongst our political classes.
Akhilesh, I want to know your view. License Raj is not the problem, it is the crony capitalism and the lack of development from below. What is your view on this, Akhilesh?
I think, Sunil, at a practical level, the way I see it, I see license Raj having come in by way of the government's emphasis that, they need to control the commanding heights of the economy. After it came in, we had an unholy nexus, as I see, between the politicians and the cronies that they wanted to support. And that kept feeding into each other. Unless there was not a license, a crony could not have come up, because that's how he cornered the goodies of the economy or the profits of the economy. Because a crony was given, let's say, a license to manufacture two-wheelers and nobody else was given. In the process, the crony flourished, the crony's political master flourished, and they kept feeding each other till a point of time came when it was completely unsustainable. Now, one offshoot of this that happened was the MSME sector or the small entrepreneur had got no access or reach or influence. The policy making was always driven by the top elite class, whether the political class or the capitalist class. And they, of course, kept monopolizing. And in the process, one toxic effect that came, according to me, Sujit, over the years has been massive inequality in society today. We see inequality in income, we see in wealth, we see in education, we see in opportunity, we see in occupation. I think it's just permeated across the board. And the crony class continues, and they continue to feed each other very, very well. The crony feeds the neta and the neta feeds the crony. So while license Raj got demolished because it became unsustainable beyond the point, but it continues in some way or the other. So I think, Sudeep, the license Raj did immense damage to the economy. Of course, Professor has given a lot of background information about it, but at a practical level, as I see it, it was the unholy nexus between the capitalist class and the political class. Both of them knew what they were doing. And in the process, one of the worst issues that has come to tackle today, and we'll discuss that with Dr. Kumar, of course, is the inequality. I'm pretty concerned about it.
Yeah, Akhilesh, just before we get into that, I want to ask Dr. Saab one more question. Dr. Saab, whenever we have seen license Raj, we've seen that the industry stunted, the quality of products stunted. So, if I say as a layman, if I would say that license Raj didn't allow industries to grow in India, didn't allow businesses to grow in India, didn't allow India to produce quality products, would I be wrong, Dr. Saab?
No, so we need to separate, as I said, the problems of licensing from the problems of cronyism. When you have cronyism, what you're saying is you're manipulating policies. And when you're manipulating policies, then policies don't work as they're supposed to work. So what was the underlying basis of license, Raj? It was that we are short of resources. Our savings and investment rate was very, very low in the 50s and in the 60s also. It had grown, but it was still very low. So we didn't have resources for development. We didn't have resources for investment. We didn't have enough resources for education, health, for infrastructure, etc., etc. So where do you raise resources? So you cut back on consumption. You cut back on the unnecessary consumption in the economy. So that's why you see licensing was what was required, taxation was required so as to raise resources, etc. So in other words, the framework of licensing and high taxation was so that the economy develops rapidly. So that was the Soviet model. The Soviet Union had developed very rapidly, coming back from a very low base, and it had managed to take on Germany, which was a highly industrialized nation, because it managed to do its thing. So we could not do that because our business community saw in that an opportunity, using cronyism to capture licenses, to corner licenses, to create shortages, etc. So we were never going to have a large amount of consumer goods of high quality in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because that was not the goal. The goal was to give education, the goal was to give health, to remove poverty, etc. So therefore, the focus was not on two-wheelers and four-wheelers. We produced only 35,000 cars until 1983 when Maruti came. Then suddenly the production of cars increased. Similarly, the focus was not on producing large number of two-wheelers. The focus was not on producing large number of telephones. So you had queues for telephones, you had queues for two-wheelers, etc. The two-wheeler quality was not necessarily very good at that point of time. The telephone lines used to always falter, etc. But that was not the focus of development. India had massive poverty, so you had to balance, so that the resources could go to remove poverty, to go to remove illiteracy, etc. And even now our literacy is not up to the mark because we have never invested enough on education, on health, etc. So the policies were basically designed for rapid development of the country, but I blame cronyism rather than the licensing for the problems that you're mentioning. It's the cronyism because our political class and our business class got together and subverted policies. They created massive black economy, and the black economy, as I've always argued, is like digging holes and filling holes. It leads to massive inefficiency. So you make a road, you don't put enough tar in it, and therefore the rains come and gets washed away. So you're rebuilding the same road rather than creating new roads. So you're always short of roads. The transportation is very poor because there are potholes in the roads, and therefore the axles break down. You consume more petrol, etc. So the inefficiency comes as a result of cronyism and the black income generation. So the policy by itself cannot be blamed for what the political economy is doing. So we need to look at the political economy as to why is it that what was supposed to be a great leadership in the 50s coming out of the national movement, very accountable, etc., why that deteriorated so rapidly because of the pressure of the business class, and the elections, the way elections were fought, with money, etc., and therefore the nexus, the business community wanted to control politics, basically, and therefore, the elections became less and less democratic over a period of time. So this is the political economy that we need to understand, because of which our policies got subverted. And that's why I've argued that black income generation leads to policy failures, because you have digging holes and filling holes, the productivity doesn't rise and the productivity remains low, quality remains very poor. So the blame has to be on the black income generation and the policy manipulation that comes out of it rather than the policy itself.
Then I want to ask a question to both you gentlemen. From a practical perspective, can we see crony capitalism and license Raj separately? Because end of the day, the way we are built, you have license Raj, you are bound to get crony capitalism. I mean, we cannot wish it away.
So my argument on that is a law by itself is not the cause of its own violation. Can you say that we have traffic lights and therefore people will jump traffic lights? So a law by itself is not the cause. It is the crony capitalism that comes, because of the political economy. The politicians and the businessmen see opportunity of bending policies. So the policy by itself is not the problem. It is the unholy nexus. It's the unaccountability of our politics, in which the businessmen and the politicians, they build a link with each other, okay, and therefore they become unaccountable to the public. In the 50s, there was an automatic accountability of the politicians because they had come from the national movement. The national movement was all about sacrifice, about serving people. But slowly that changed. The nature of politics changed, that politics is now being controlled by big money, by big business. That's where the monopoly capital, became a big problem in the 60s, and the Hazari Commission came in 1967 with its report showing how the big business had grown dramatically, through the umbrella pattern of holding, etc., which was manipulating policies. So it's the political interest of the big business that was subverting policies. And they would subvert any policy. They would subvert the policy of licensing. They would subvert the policy of education. For instance, we had in our political parties large number of feudal elements. They did not want to give the poor children education. So when I went to rural development, in 1977, then the landlord used to come to and say, why do you give education to these children of the poor people? Who will do the free work for me? Who will take my cattle to the field? So even in 77, what was true in 76, that our leadership came from the landlord class, and they did not want education to spread to the children. And that's why we never emphasized education. Look at Southeast Asia. They by 1965 had put all children into education. Malaysia went to spend 10% of GDP on education, so that everybody is literate. And that's why Amartya Sen in an article in 1986 pointed out that why is it Southeast Asia did very well, whereas India did not do well, whereas in 1947 we were all at the same level of poverty and illiteracy, And he said they spent massively on education and health. So the leadership there emphasized the real things that would improve productivity, Whereas in India, it's the political economy which prevented expenditure on education, on health, and there was always shortage of resources because the resources were being wasted given the crony capitalism and the black income generation.
Akhilesh, I want to ask you, putting up a traffic light, knowing very well that nobody is going to adhere to the traffic light and people are going to jump traffic, then is there a need to put that traffic light?
Sujit, I look at it like this. The ethos or the essence of crony capitalism is all about favoring a few. Okay, so was the case of license Raj. A few got favored with the license Raj. To me, there have been two sides of the same coin. Along with that came something even more, not good for the economy. I mean, if a Suzuki can come into India in the late 80s or the early 90s, why could it not have come in the early 60s or the early 70s when India needed technology, when India needed capital? We just blocked them. It's only when we fell on our knees that the economy could not run on our own that we let them come in. The fact of the matter is that this entire thing of getting licenses has just prevented India's dynamism from coming up, and today it's got perpetrated. We may not have license Raj today, but today because of capitalism, there are automatic barriers to people coming into businesses, which is by itself some kind of a license Raj coming in that everybody can't get into it. I think they have just fed each other. And as Dr. Kumar very rightly points out, it has all had to do with political economy. And it is they who have, derailed us. He very rightly discussed social indicators like education, etc. Where are we today, Sujit, on social indicators? A report says we are 3 decades behind China in social indicators. Why did that happen? Whereas the founding fathers themselves had laid a lot of emphasis, as Dr. Kumar pointed out, on social indicators, on education, on healthcare, on equality, and we lost it out. I mean, today a country like China is decades ahead of us just on social indicators. So coming back, I think if it is the political economy which has spoiled it all and it has got us here, well, something was seriously wrong with the way we governed ourselves. But to come to your basic question, I think if we go to the essence of crony capitalism and license Raj, they have fed each other big time.
Great.
I just, no, Sujit, just one moment. You
Please,
see,
please.
Why in the 1950s we did not go for, say, Maruti Suzuki? Because we were a very poor country. There's massive poverty. At the time of independence, 88% of the workforce was in agriculture. Agriculture was producing 55% of GDP.
Yes.
There's very little of industrialization. So at that time, the emphasis could not be on producing cars. It was not an important thing. It was not an important thing to produce more cars and more scooters and refrigerators, etc., which were there in the Western economies. The emphasis was on trying to meet the basic needs of the people. And that's why in 65, 67, we went in for, say, industrialization of the heavy industry kind in the 50s. But that meant that agriculture was being marginalized, and therefore agriculture did not have enough development, and we had the big drought of 65, 67. So in other words, you see, the basic the problems of the economy in the 50s and 60s were quite different from what they are in the 90s or today in the 2010s and the 2020s. So at that time, the national movement had accepted that we have to remove poverty. We have to bring everybody up. We cannot have this kind of inequality, etc. So the focus had to be very different at that time in the 50s and 60s. That's why, if we had opened up and we had started producing cars, then that may have actually set back the economy even further. Our education would have been even further set back because our resources would have got diverted there rather than to what we did in terms of opening up colleges, universities, dispensaries, etc. And you can see the effect of that was that the death rate declined dramatically in the 50s and 60s. So even though the death rate was still high, but not as high as in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, because we spent on this thing, and that's why our population started rising, because our growth of population is based on the birth rate minus the death rate. The birth rate remained the same, the death rate declined very rapidly, and therefore the population started rising. But the fact that the death rate came down was because we started emphasizing social indicators, we started emphasizing education, health, etc., because those are more important. So I think we have to realize the context in which the policies are made, the context in which the Bombay plan was made. So we needed a control over the total investment in the economy because we were short of resources. And that's why we had to do import substitution strategy, because from 55, 56 we started having balance of payment problem. Before that we didn't have balance of payment problem because people are poor. They weren't importing that much. So after 55, 56 we went in for import substitution rather than the export strategy, which is what Southeast Asia adopted. So we have to look at the context of our economy, context of our political economy, to be able to understand why we did certain things in the 50s. So I'm not saying we have not developed. We have developed massively compared to 1947, but we have not developed as much as, say, the Southeast Asian economies have developed, because policies here started failing. This crony capitalism, was very large.
Dr. Saab, this question I want to ask you, and then of course I want to come to Akhilesh too. Was there a difference between Nehru's vision of Indian economy and Indira Gandhi's vision of Indian economy?
Well, to a certain extent, because the context was very different. Nehru came from the national movement, where, as I said, the idea was that the individual is not to blame, and we have to be a collectivity. By the time Indira Gandhi came, the political economy had changed. The political economy was changing rapidly. Monopolies had grown. The consensus of national movement had declined. Indian politics was fragmenting. And therefore, Indira Gandhi was not a visionary like Nehru was. She was, dealing at a very practical level, the kind of divisions, and when she came to power, she was called a Gungi Gudiya, because she was sort of stuck. She didn't know what really to do. So she was sort of facing the problems of the organization Congress, the right wing in the Congress party, the pro-business, lobby in the Congress party, whereas Congress party was also splintering. The farming groups were coming out. The socialist group had already come out earlier in the 50s. So the Congress party itself was changing, and that vision of the post-independence period was declining. As I said earlier, the Naxalite movement started in 1967 because the fruits of development had not gone down below. monopoly capital was there, MRTP Act was implemented, the planned holiday came in 67, 68, 69. So the entire, framework was floundering. The framework that had been set up in the 50s with which Nehru operated. The China war took place, the Pakistan war in 65 took place. So, we had to start spending a lot more on the military, etc. So in the changing context, Indira Gandhi was coping. And therefore, her decision making was not as visionary as Nehru's was. She was more ad hoc decision making. But she gained an upper hand when in 1971 the Bangladesh war took place and India won that war. And then she came up with the Garibi Hatao slogan in the 1971 election, which again proved to be popular because the Garibi was still there. The Naxalite movement was a representative of the fact that the poverty was still persisting in the Indian economy. Large number of poor people were there, etc. So Indira Gandhi was a more practical, but she turned into a very strong leader. But again, that strength of hers proved to be a problem because she was playing politics all the time. Whether it be the emergency, because her premiership was threatened, so she levied the emergency. Then in Punjab also and Kashmir also, the way the politics was played, it led to terrorism in those areas. So Indira Gandhi, in a sense, had a very different period and a very different ethos to deal with. And that's why what she did was very different from what Nehru did.
Akhilesh, you want to add anything to this?
Sujit, I would put it in a bit of a nuanced perspective, but probably on the same lines as Dr. Kumar says. If we talk about the Nehru era and we talk the post-Nehru era that you spoke about, I think Nehru had a lot of strategy and vision in mind. Now, after a strategy comes policy. So in his time, probably there were strategies. We may not agree with them. We may have our own difference of opinion, but there were national strategies. When it came to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, it was more of policy and less of strategy. Today, that legacy to me continues. As a nation today, I would actually want to ask, we seem to be deficit on strategy. We seem to be heavy on policy. And I think that's the major difference that was there between Mr. Nehru and his daughter.
Okay, good. I will come to the contemporary economics. But before that, I want to again ask both you gentlemen a very basic question. Sir, is there a difference? Is there a core difference between the right-wing economic policies, right-wing economic vision, and the left-wing economic vision? Is there a difference, Dr. Saab?
Yes. The difference is what is your vision of society? When you think of right-wing policies, they base it on individuals. Whereas when you think of left-wing policies, they're based on communities, they're based on classes. So therefore, there's a fundamental difference, and that's why the post-1991 phase, where we gave up the earlier vision that individuals are not to blame, now in the new vision post-1991, it is the individuals who are to blame for their problems. So if you're poor, you are to blame for your problem. If you're illiterate, you are to blame for your problem. If you don't have health, then you are to blame for your problem. You have to go to the market to solve the situation. Whereas in the left-wing policies, it was the collectivity that would take care of you. That was the post-1947 consensus of the national movement. So we have changed policies 180 degrees, from where the collectivity will take care of the problems to now individuals have to find their own solutions to their own problems. So the right-wing policies and the left-wing policies are completely opposed to each other. And that's why you see, even though inequalities were increasing, even in the pre-1991 phase, because of crony capitalism, because of black economy and so on. But post-1991, these policies that have been followed, what is called the Washington Consensus, they have led to dramatic rise in inequalities, So far greater inequality has come up post-1991. So even though the middle classes and the upper classes have gained in terms of the goodies, in terms of the color televisions, the cars, and the various other consumer goods that have come, but the inequalities have increased dramatically, And as I've been saying, poverty has not declined, even though the per capita income has risen. But what is called the social minimum necessary consumption, that has also risen as consumerism has risen, as cost of living has increased, etc., etc. So poverty has not declined, and that's why you see in the Delhi socio-economic survey that 90% of Delhi families spend less than 25,000 rupees per month, and 98% spend less than 50,000 rupees per month. And these are, what are indicators of the extent of poverty in the country. that 90% spend less than 25,000 rupees per month in Delhi, which has a per capita income multiple times of the, say, Bihar and other places. So when this is the situation in Delhi, you can imagine what it would be in other poorer areas of the country. So what we see is, a large number of people consuming, cars and luxury items, etc., and think that the whole country is doing that. So we have to disaggregate and then see what has happened. So the right-wing policies have led to enormous problems, and that's what we saw during the pandemic also. Because in the pandemic, 90% said that we don't have enough money to buy even 1 week's supply. So that indicates the extent of the poverty, that 90% don't have savings even for 1 week's supplies. So that's what I call poverty. So the right-wing policies, which are based on the individual rather than on the collective, they're based on the Washington consensus. And this is globally. As Krugman pointed out in 2005 in an article, that in 2001, the inequality in the US were greater than what they used to be in the 1920s. So inequalities have increased dramatically world over with the Washington consensus that has been prevailing since the 1980s in the world.
Akhilesh?
My perspective is like this. Of course, Professor has so very well defined the theory behind it. But the reality is that whether it is right wing or left wing, they are a package. They come with their merits, they come with their demerits. That's the reality. As far as India is concerned, by opting for a hybrid or a mixed model, we neither became capitalist nor did we become socialist. We neither became a USA and neither did we become a China or Soviet Russia. And I think that's where we lost out. We somewhere got into a hypocrisy of policy making because some people said we don't want to be right wing and some said we don't want to be left wing. And the result is there to see. If we had pursued one policy with conviction, without any compromise or delusions, maybe we could have become the top class in that respective policy or that respective perception. But this hybrid mixed model, to me, it just became a hypocrisy that suited the political class. And we are neither America today, nor are we a China today.
Akhilesh,
Sudhir, I would say
sorry.
No great nation should ever copy anybody else.
Correct.
All great nations must have their own strategy of development. It is precisely because we tried to copy the Western modernity. And the Western modernity had two models: the Soviet model of central planning and the Western model of the free market. And we tried to copy that together. But both are models of top-down approach. Whereas in a very poor country where 88% were in agriculture, at the time of independence, we needed to follow Gandhi's strategy of bottom-up approach, which we did not. If it followed the bottom-up approach, I think we would have done much better. It's the top-down approach that led to crisis after crisis, as I was pointing out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So in a sense, it's the wrong policy choice. It is the elite of India which had Western modernity as a model. Whereas, our capacity in the 50s and 60s was not going to enable us to achieve that Western modernity quickly, So it's like, we said, oh, here's a bus going, let us jump on it quickly, And that is the problem that we faced with trying to copy Western modernity, trying to become like a Western advanced economy, which only 3% of Indians could do, 97% could not do.
I had a few questions to ask Dr. Saab. How can I miss the opportunity of, not taking his wisdom on? Dr. Saab, the first question I have for you is, post-independence, of course, the Britishers had repressed the polity and the economy of India. So post-independence, we started recording a faster growth rate, which was comparable to our peers then, which was China, South Africa, Brazil, and even South Korea. But later on, our peers started growing faster, especially if you look at the Eastern economies. Why is it that we continue to, go on with a muddled approach rather than having a more precise strategy in tune with the times? Okay, some things may not have worked, but why were we not open to changing our policies at the right time, Doctor?
As I said, Amartya in his 1986 article pointed to the fact that Southeast Asian economies spend massively on education, health, building up the infrastructure and so on, We did not do that, and that is because you see large elements in our political system were coming from the feudal elements. So in India, feudal elements have been very strong in policy making, and on the other hand, the business community was rising, and the business community had its own interest. And so therefore, there was a breakdown of social consensus, We did not spend on education because the feudal classes did not want it. If you read the Suitable Boy also talks about why expenditure on education did not increase because the feudal elements didn't want it. And as I said in 1977, I faced that when I did rural development. The landlord there used to say, "Why are you educating these children? I need these children for free labor in my fields to take my cattle out to grazing, etc." So the feudal elements and the capitalist elements, they together could not build a consensus on the way the economy should develop, the way it should be development from below. But they said, okay, we'll copy the Western modernity, and they tried to copy what was not relevant for India at that point of time, with the massive poverty that was existing, then to go in for this big development project, the big dams and the big, heavy industry, etc. That was an attempt to catch up with the West. But that was not the strategy that was needed for the very poor country. So we fell between several stools, and we've never come out of that. We have reinforced even till today. There's massive feudalism in the country. People in position of power, they say, "What's the use of being in power if I cannot bend it for my friends and cronies?" So if you go to an office, people will say, "This fellow is clean. He doesn't let us also make money." So in other words, the feudal elements in society have got reinforced, and the British rule had reinforced feudalism in India because they used the feudal elements to control the rural areas. So feudalism, which was, say, in the 18th century, slowly dissipating all over the world, in India it got strengthened because the British used the feudal elements, the landlords in the rural areas, to push their rule. So those are the problems that India faced in the 50s and 60s, and we've never been able to get over them because our politics got fragmented. And as you very correctly said, that post Nehru, the vision has dissipated. The vision is now ad hoc. What you say policy, I call it ad hoc, because if a policy is not structured in a vision, then it's ad hoc policy. So I call it ad hocism. And as you go from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the present, ad hocism has increased. So policies are not structured in a big framework of how they will help the country. They're for some component of the economy, for some segment of the economy. So whether it be reservation issue or with other issues that we are dealing with, it's all because development has not been for everybody. Development from above has not reached down, so everybody is fighting for the gains of development. So we have lost our direction.
So on that losing direction, Doctor, I have a question. If you see some of the major milestones in the Indian economy over the years, to me, the 1966 devaluation was a major milestone. 1969 was another one. 1973, the oil crisis was another one. And 1991. If you notice a common thread in all of them, we seem to take a policy only when things go disastrously wrong and there's no way out. Why is it that we do not evolve a policy in time, and why are we so reactive or disaster oriented before? I mean, since 1991, if you see, I would in fact want to ask you, because I'm not so learned as you are, is there a major economic event that you would talk about in the country that you would say that after 91, this is another major economic milestone? We always react. We never do a planning which is forward looking. Why are we not like this, Doctor?
As I was saying, our consensus that existed at the time of independence, that has slowly got shattered. So there are different groups fighting, and that's why I'm saying political economy, and the political economy has gone in the control of the big business now. Okay, so it's the big business which now controls policies and leaving out large number of other people, and that's why the consensus is very fragile, and that's why instead of having a vision of how to develop India and how to make India great, what we see is ad hoc policy making. And ad hoc policy making has constantly grown, in the country, from, as we discussed, Indira Gandhi's time to Janta Dal to, Rajiv Gandhi. And Rajiv Gandhi had a vision, but did not know how to implement that vision. He said India would be great by 2001, a clean government, etc. And all that fell flat, And then we had the Narasimha Rao government and the 1991 policy change. But that policy change meant a 180-degree change in policies of the 1947. And that became more ad hoc in some sense, And all the problems that we face today of poverty, of the people not being able to cope with the pandemic, the roots of that go back to the 1991 policies. So in other words, you see the 1991 policies which have led to massive increase in inequality are creating further political and social and economic problems for the country. And that's why even before the pandemic, the economy was slowing down, and that's why you could see that in the present regime, you had a lot of ad hoc things like demonetization and GST, which is not suited to India, was also implemented because it was something that big business wanted. It is something that the MNCs wanted, but that's not suitable for the unorganized sector. And 99% of our units are unorganized sector. So what is not suited to the 99%, we are implementing that for the benefit of the remaining 1%. So how much more ad hoc can you be? Because if you cannot marginalize 99% of your units and hope to develop, because it'll create problems. You cannot marginalize 94% who are in the unorganized sector and hope to develop, because they'll create political and social problems, and the consensus will never be achieved. So it is this big loss of big vision. It's the ad hocism of policies that characterize everything. And post 1991, what you ask, what are the big things that have happened? The earlier, you see, the global financial crisis came in 2007-8. That set the economy back, because by 2007-8, the India's investment rate had reached 37.5%. It again touched that in 2012-13, but since then it has fallen. And it's because of policy-induced problems that we've had these problems, whether it be demonetization, GST, the banking, NPA crisis that has come in the economy, and now, of course, this massive, loss because of the pandemic and the lockdown, etc. So post 1991, again, there have been many, many problems that have taken place in the economy.
We cannot end the show without knowing your views about the economic liberalization. Akhilesh, I'll start with you. What is your view about the economic liberalization?
I think 1991 was something which should have happened many years earlier, I think. As I said, it is because we reached in a disaster, desperate situation that it almost got forced on us as part of the IMF conditions. And I think the youth of my generation in particular at that time would have been unshackled much earlier in case we had embarked upon them. I never understood, Sujit, frankly, and this is as a citizen of the country, that why did the nation not over the years see how other countries were developing? Dr. Kumar is very right in saying that one country's model cannot apply to another. But one country's vision and strategy that achieves a certain goal can always be emulated rather than reinventing the wheel when everything goes bad. So I think 1991 was something we needed, but we should have come much earlier. And I think it shows in the fact that when we compare ourselves with our immediate neighbor China, we are really, behind decades. Social indicators which have always mattered to India in such a big way, we are 3 decades behind as per a recent report I read. Income indicators, we are still 15 to 20 years behind. I think we could have been where we ought to be in terms of the potential that my Bharat has. I really have an issue there, Sujit.
Dr. Saab, quickly your view, because we have spoken about this. We had an exclusive discussion on this, but quickly your view on 1991.
So, 1991 did a complete policy, paradigm shift, from, assuming that individuals are not to blame to now saying individuals are to blame. So the new policies that came in 1991 were all based on the neoliberal philosophy of consumerism and so on. And consumerism has become the opium of the masses. You can divert their attention from the real issues of the economy and society to consumerism by promising them, more luxury items and so on, And so, even the poor people have been absorbed into that consumerism of a kind. So the question is, what kind of society are we building? And the pandemic has shown that, this kind of vision of society will not work for India. The massive, migration that you saw from urban to rural areas shows that the poverty has not declined. Poverty remains in different forms. So in a sense, we have to go back to the 1947 vision where we say collectively we have to tackle our problems, and the pandemic shows that unless you eliminate the virus everywhere, the virus will continue to proliferate. So it has to be a collective effort. So whether it be in education, whether it be in health, etc., it has to be a collectivity, and the public sector has to be strengthened in these areas. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve a vision of a great India. And as I said, you see, while you're right that we need to learn lessons, but we need to learn the right lessons. We cannot copy. China did not have the political system that we had. and South Korea didn't have the political system that we had. So the political economy is very important. So we cannot say because China did it 30 years earlier, we could have done it 30 years earlier. Look at the context of the mid 70s when Mao Zedong passed away and Deng Xiaoping came to power. That was a time when USA was using China to undermine Soviet Union and allowed access to market and technology to China, which it did not allow to India. So the conditions in which China started changing were very different from the 1991 conditions in which India started changing. The world markets were not available. The WTO came, and the WTO was to capture India's markets for the MNCs, etc. Whereas the China never allowed its markets to be captured with MNCs. They always restricted them to the coastal regions from which they could export. And they had Hong Kong through which they could do a lot of export, to the rest of the market. India was not allowed that kind of a thing. So look at how backward we are in terms of R&D. Our LCA program, which started in sometime in 1980s, late 1980s, is still not fulfilled. And the engine is the F505 of 1993 version. The main battle tank, has a Leopard engine, and that program also has not been successful. So even in critical defense areas, we've not been able to develop technology rapidly because we have not emphasized R&D. And why have we not emphasized R&D? Because we've not emphasized higher education. And why have we not emphasized higher education? Because we've not emphasized primary education. So unless you have good education, how do you develop good R&D? China has leapfrogged because it emphasized education, it emphasized health, it emphasized productivity. And therefore, in technology terms, as I've been saying, China is now leader in 5G. We have never developed 2G, 3G, 4G, and they are leaders in 5G. They are leaders in many other areas, of technology in the last 30 years because they emphasize. So the vision should have been to develop India in technology terms. The emphasis should be to improve the productivity of everybody and lower the disparities in the economy so that we can collectively take a vision. That has been completely missing. And the post 1991, that has been missing even more.
Gentlemen, I have 5 minutes, but I need to ask you 2 questions in this 5 minutes. So please try and keep your answers concise, but we really need to visit this. My question number 1 is, Atal Bihari Vajpayee government was the first right-wing major government that India saw. Was there a difference between the Atal Bihari vision of India, economic-wise, and the Congress vision of India? Was there a difference? Akhilesh, why don't you start?
By the time Mr. Vajpayee came to power, the 1991 flavor was already there. And the 1919 flavor to me just continued during his time. And well, to give him all the marks, he was a far more inclusive, open, and liberal-minded leader in terms of taking everyone along. So it suited very well. As far as the Congress model was concerned, I think there were so many disparities in it. And as you had earlier asked, Mr. Nehru was different, Mrs. Gandhi was different, and they were the main 2 Congress people who were there at that time. One had a strategy, the other only had a policy and ad hocism. When Mr. Vajpayee came, he came with an independent mind, he came with an inclusive mind, he came with an open mind. So the economy also reflected that kind of exuberance at that point of time. So I think he was very different from what the Congress perhaps was to be.
Dr. Saab.
Well, as I said, we have to look at paradigm shifts. And paradigm shift had taken place in 1991. So even though Mr. Vajpayee came to power talking about, Swadeshi, he actually did exactly what the Narasimha Rao government had been doing earlier. There was very little difference. In fact, if you see 96, 97, the rate of growth of the economy had picked up, then it went down again. And during Vajpayee's initial years, the rate of growth had fallen because the agriculture markets had opened up under pressure from WTO. And it's only towards the end, the last year, that the rate of growth had picked up when he started talking about, the great achievements, etc. So Vajpayee's years were not, in terms of economic progress, any better than what the previous 10 years of the Congress regime were. It's only in 2003-04 that Vajpayee did better. But otherwise, his policies were exactly on lines that the new economic policies were. They were not very different. He tried for disinvestment. There was a disinvestment ministry, but that was also not very successful. So this privatization program that started in 1991, which Vajpayee had hoped to accelerate, did not. But I think one thing that he did do was the nuclear, the bombs that were tested during his regime, which was what Narasimha Rao could not do because of American pressure. Vajpayee did it, and we had sanctions, and that affected the economy in the beginning of Vajpayee's rule, etc. But then when Manmohan Singh came after Vajpayee, the economy picked up very dramatically for the next 3-4 years till the global financial crisis came and the economy came down. And we've had problems as a result of all these things.
Dr. Saab, my last question. Your views on the current economic status.
Okay, the economy is in dire trouble because you see the large number of poor people have suffered previously and therefore demand is down. If you look at the RBI data, then already in January 2021 when the economy was supposed to have recovered, the consumer confidence was down to 55.5 as compared to 105 a year back, and that during the second wave has further declined. Capacity utilization was down to 63% from 70% earlier. That means even the organized sector was 10% down. Now, our data does not include the unorganized sector, so the official data does not tell you the truth about the growth rate of the economy. The growth rate of the economy, which the government says only fell by 7%, actually fell by 29% according to my calculation because of the unorganized sector decline. And even agriculture had declined because a lot of fruits and vegetables had rotted, poultry had come down and milk production had come down, etc. because it was not being consumed. So in other words, the economy is in much worse shape than the official data suggests, and the poor are suffering as a result. The unorganized sector is suffering. Unless we take care of that, the problems will mount in the coming years. The stock market does not reflect what's happening at the ground level to the poor, to the unorganized sector, and that is going to be an instability that will come in the financial sector, which can again create a problem just like we had at the time of Harshad Mehta scam in 1992 and the dot-com bust that happened in 2001. So, I'm a bit worried that this exuberance in the financial markets, could lead to another problem. So I think we are facing a lot of headwinds and the economy can be in a lot of trouble in the coming years unless the correct policies are followed. These supply side policies which are creating problems, whether it be farmers protesting, the labor protesting, etc. These are not the kind of policies that will get us out of the economic problems that we are facing. What we need are demand side policies at the moment because demand is weak, investment is down, consumption is down. So we need demand side policies. But for some reason, the government is sticking to the supply side policies. The Prime Minister's address to the CII also implies that there's no solution to the farm problem. In fact, the farm bills are a gift to the big business, but they're not a gift to the farmers. And farmers constitute the majority of the workforce in the country. And if you don't do something right for them, then how would the economy come out of the morass that it's likely to be heading to?
Akhilesh, two things. First of all, your point of view on this. And secondly, if you could just sum up today's discussion.
So, it's like this. I completely second what Dr. Kumar says about the state of the Indian economy. What really bothers me today are rising inequality. I'm very worried about it. The rising poverty, the shrinking middle class, the dipping household savings, the inability of the consumer to spend, the rising unemployment, and to top all that, a state of denial from the government is what bothers the most. They still want to give data which is doctored and rosy, which we know at the ground level. I mean, as consultants who are, in touch with businessmen and industry on a daily basis, you really can't fool people like us. We experience this state of affairs on a daily basis. So I am completely in sync with what Dr. Kumar has to say about the present state of the economy. Let's see, where do we really head to? As far as today's discussion is concerned, Dr. Kumar very rightly pointed out that we started at the time of independence. It was all about not, the individual per se, but the country per se. And that it has to be a collective effort. It has to be a collective welfare for everybody. And we started from there. Somewhere we lost our bearings because of political economy and because of the sharp differences that were there between the founding fathers led by Mr. Nehru and then by Mrs. Gandhi when the baton was passed on to her. And after that, what we witness today is a lot of ad hocism in the economy. And well, this is where we are after all of it. So I think a lot needs to be done before we really say Mera Bharat Mahan.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. It was such an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much.